Today, we're going to talk about the phases of the moon and how we are using those phases, as well as the rotation of the Earth around the sun, to plan some of the events happening on Earth with respect to traditions, religions, and social festivities. I'm going to especially about Ramadan. I'm going to talk about the Chinese New Year, and I will also talk about the Catholic Easter. So let's see if we can talk about how phases of the moon are affecting or guiding our traditions. The first thing to do is to look at how the phases of the moon are coming about. So let's see if I can do it this way. Perfect. So here you could see the sun. Just behind, we have the Earth that is orbiting around the sun, but we also have the moon orbiting around the earth. So let's see what we find. So because we have here the sun and we have the moon between the sun and earth, what happens is the sun's light goes on the far side of the moon. So here from our perspective, no light is coming from the moon. So we have what we call a new moon. But as soon as the moon is or starting to go a bit further away, what happens is the sun's light goes to the moon and then is reflected back to us. And here we have the first crescent right here. I think they're called, I think it's waxing moon, or waxing crescent, if I remember well. So what happens is as the moon is moving around the earth, eventually you get to a point where from the sun's perspective, the earth is between the sun and the moon. So what happens? We have a full moon and all the light of the earth of the moon comes to us. Now, when that happens, ever so often, we have the planet that comes between the sunlight and the moon, and we have at that point some lunar eclipse. As the moon is continuing its path, what happens here is that the quantity of light coming back to us as it reflects on the surface of the moon gets smaller and smaller, and eventually you have the waning crescent to the point where the moon goes back to its place between the sun and earth when we have a new moon again. Now, what's interesting here is that there's another aspect to keep in mind, and it is how Earth is orbiting around the sun. Because of its orbit, and because of its axis of rotation, what happens is that we have seasons throughout the year. On top of that, we have what we call the winter solstice, which is a shorter day of the month of the year, longer night. We have the summer solstice, which is the longest day and the shortest night. And we have here during the spring and the fall, what we call the equinox. And these are also part of what we use to build our traditions. We have here the Gregorian calendar. So here, as you can see, this calendar is accepted and used almost in all countries around the world. We have 12 months, January to December. Each of the months have 28 or 29 days in February, and for the other months, we have 30 and 31 days. All of these is based on the fact that we have 1 year or 365.25 days for the Earth to orbit around the sun. And that creates a situation where there's a December 25th that happens every year at the same time. So some festivities for some society, some religion happens all at the same time. Now you have to keep in mind that if you are looking at the moon phases, a cycle for the moon phases is 29.5 days. So that means that there are more cycles of the moon than days in a year. So that can affect how people are using the orbit of the Earth around the sun, as well as the lunar phases. So let's see what we've got. So here, this is a beautiful website called moongiant.com, and it shows us all the phases. Now, it's important here because on February 27th, we had a new moon with zero illumination. As we went through February 28th to March 1st, which is today, we started to have the first crest here coming from the moon. And what's interesting here in this year is that this is coming also for the first day of the month of Ramadan for the Muslim community. So what's happening here is that as soon as we see the first light reflected back to Earth, that brings up a cycle. So 29.5 days of Ramadan for the Islamic community. So that's quite interesting because I've learned quite a fun things in my research this week because many of my students are celebrating Ramadan and they were absent on Friday. So here from Friday 28th to today, March 1st, is the beginning of Ramadan. So here, as you can see, in March, we have Ramadan. And what's interesting here is even though the Gregorian calendar, we have 2025 here, they are here for historical reason, their year 1446. Now, what's interesting and that I did not know, so here I have the Islamic Hijri calendar for 2025. What you have to remember to notice is that first of all, we have their year 1446 and not 2025 for the um, Gregorian calendar. And what's interesting is you can see they have 12 months, and 12 months are based on the lunar cycle of 29.5 days. So that means that all their months are either 29 or 30 days. What I learned as well is that those years for the 12 months are not in sync with our 12 months of the Gregorian calendar because the Islamic Hijri calendar has 12 months of 29 to 30 days, which means that their calendar year is about 354, 355 days. So that means that being shorter, there's a shift, and every year, each of these months are different and on they're shifted a few days. And what happens, we have the same month at the same time coming back every 30 years. Some calculations, but it's kind of interesting to do. The other one here is that if you see the 12th month of 1446 brings us to June, and at that time it will go to the first month and it will be year 1447. And one thing I did not know is that Ramadan is actually the ninth month of their calendar, which is interesting, and it's called Ramadan right here. Good. Now, how do we so there you go. Very nice, very nice, very nice. So how do we know when Ramadan starts? They're looking at here. Let's see this one right here. They are looking at the lunar cycle, and Ramadan starts at the first light of the first crescent here of the moon for this cycle. So that's how it goes, and it lasts for 29.5 months. So as you could see, I'm going to go through and you'll see how the month is going by. So here we have the beginning of the light, and as we are going along by the days, we can see there are more and more light going through all the way to about the 14th, if I remember well. And on the 14th, we have a full, so March 13th and 14th, we have a full, there you go. We have full moons, and here this is the middle of the lunar cycle. So if we continue the 14, 15, 16, then you could see here that the quantity of light is decreasing up to the point where we get on March 28th, we have 1% left, and the new moon on the March 29th. So the Ramadan stops and ends on March 29th, which is then the beginning of the new month, which is the 10th month of their calendar. So it's very interesting to see how they're using the phases of the moon to build a calendar, but also not dictates, but show how religion is working. And I was realizing that in the research I did, how do we know when the first light of the first crescent is coming about? So some places around the world, it's the humans have to see the first light coming from the moon. Other places, they use science and astronomy to calculate when will be the time when Ramadan would start. But depending on the local traditions and local understanding of different groups, it seems that it is accepted, which is very interesting. And that so this is interesting. So this is what we call. So this is how we have this month Ramadan starting. Now, there's something else that the phases of the moon are using, and the other one that was interesting here that I learned was the Chinese New Year. So the Chinese New Year this year was on January 29th, 2025, and it is the year of the snake. Now, how do we know when the New Year is? Because it's not always at the same time. That's something I learned as well. So here, this is something from National Geographic, and here it goes like this. Um, The month of the Chinese calendar. So here they're using the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. So both of them. So what do? They go like this. The next year starts on the new moon nearest to the midpoint between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. And that always lies between January 21st or February 20th. So let's see if I can see this one here. So for this one here, it's between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. So when the earth is at about right here, then they look at the new moon. When the new moon stands and starts, then we have their new year. So there again, there's some similarities with the other culture. Now, interestingly enough, which something I did not know is that China officially adopted the Gregorian calendar used by the West in 1912, which is something new, but they're still using their traditions to go and plan for their social activities. Now, the other one that is also interesting is this idea here or the date of Easter. Easter every year for the Catholics are not at the same time of the year because there's a few things they have to look into, and they're using the solar orbit around the sun as well as the phases of the moon. So here, if you look at this one here, in order to be able to have Easter for the Catholics anyway, and a few associated religion, it Easter will always happen after the spring equinox. So that's the first thing. Second, it always happens after a full moon. Let's see, after a full moon, after the spring equinox. And on top of that, it will occur on a Sunday. So here there's a few things that need to happen. So first of all, in the year, they need to go say, okay, we get into the spring equinox. So that's the first condition. If it happens that, let's say from March 20th, we have a full moon a day or two after, let's say March 22nd, and then Sunday falls right after. We can have an Easter as early as March 22nd or 23rd. Okay, so that's interesting. That's early. But why would some Easter end up in April? Well, that's interesting. Let's say that you come to the spring equinox and that at that time you had a full moon a couple days before the spring equinox. So what happens is that you have the spring equinox, then you have to go for 29 days to go through a whole cycle of the moon to be able to. So if you start here, you just finished the full moon, so you have to go just finish full moon. There you go. So you have to go through the new moon again, and then from the new moon go to the full moon. So that can take 28, 29 days depending on the date you're looking in for. And if it happens that the full moon ends up on a Monday, then the following Sunday is 7 days later. So from there, you end up with March 20th plus 29 days for the next lunar cycle. So that brings us to about, let's see, April 20th or so. And then you have to add a week if we end up on a Monday, and that ends up in April, and let's see what the date we have right here. So usually it can go all the way to April 24th, which is quite far compared to March 23rd. So it's interesting to see how it is. And then again, we have a religion that is using the orbit of the Earth around the sun as well as the moon phases. So I thought you'd be interested to see and hear about these ideas about the moon phases, especially that Ramadan is starting. We just went through the Chinese New Year. That was a month ago, and we are going into Easter in the next month or so. So lots of things happening this spring. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video about science, astronomy, and some culture. I'm going to see you here in another video related to science and astronomy. You'll see you like it. I'll see you there.